Hey there, grace and peace to you today. I am Captain Roger McCord from the Salvation Army's Hanford Corps. This is The Shield Online, a streaming version of our Sunday morning message. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. As always, any questions or comments are welcome. Respectful debate is encouraged, and Jesus is always Lord. And now that you know where I'm coming from, let me tell you a story. It was a hard morning. The people of the small town had woken to the wails from a woman whose son had died in the night. Now, every death is a tragedy, but in this case it was a double blow, because first, the man in question was young. He was just entering the prime of life. He hadn't even married yet. Second, and perhaps even more tragic, he was the last family his mother had. He had been an only child. His father had died some time ago, and his mother was already the only surviving member of her family. So the death of her son meant that this woman was alone. There was a Hebrew word for this, and it was almana, one without a voice. In that time and place, women had no public role. They couldn't go get their own legitimate job or earn their own money. They were not allowed to inherit. They were truly voiceless. I'm sure there were exceptions here and there, because there always are, but the culture and the law forbid it. And heaven forbid you question the way we've always done things, right? So, a woman alone was lost. Now, if a widow was young enough, she might remarry, or if her father's family was still around and had the means to do so, she might be taken back in and cared for there. These things were also not normal, though. Normal was for a woman to have a son who would care for her. There was no bond stronger in that culture than the one between a mother and son. The oldest son in particular was her lifelong protector and caretaker. It was his duty and it was his honor to uphold that duty. There may have been no greater compliment than to be a good son for your mother. And that son was not just growing up and moving out. He was his mother's security in her old age. He was the one who was responsible for making sure that she was housed and cared for when his father could not do so any longer. There's a story of Jesus hanging on the cross, gasping out his final breaths, and his mother came near. And one of his disciples was there too, a man of some means, and Jesus said to them that he would be her son from then on, and that Mary would be that disciple's mother. In death, Jesus discharged the duty he had been raised with, honoring his widowed mother by arranging for her care, even though he had younger brothers who could have assumed that responsibility in his absence. To be a widow, voiceless, without support, was a death sentence of its own. You had no status, no home, and no legitimate means to earn a living. The very word that meant you were a widow came to be a symbol for being oppressed and exploited, because that kind of abuse was your best hope if you continued to live. And in this town, people woke to keening that let them know that this has happened to a woman living among them. Now, following an ancient tradition, the dead were buried that day, if it was possible to do so before dark, or early the next if it weren't. In this case, by mid-afternoon, the corpse had been washed clean, then anointed and wrapped with spices that would both encourage the decomposition and discourage the smell. The cloths holding these balms on were snugged tightly around the deceased, and his face was covered with a wrap that was secured separately. 7 days of mourning would begin once the remains had been placed in a nearby tomb. This town was called Nain, and it was built on the side of a small mountain called the Hill of Morah, although some called it Little Hermon. It was in Galilee, the northern province of Israel, but it was tucked so far down in the southeastern corner that it was almost in Samaria, the center province. There were no regular trade routes anywhere near here, and there never had been, but the region often played an important part in the history of the Promised Land nonetheless. It was here that the Midianites had been camping when Gideon, at God's command, had brought 300 men with trumpets and lanterns to wake them, sowing chaos that caused the invaders to fall on each other and defeat themselves. Lower on the hillside, towards the plain of Esdraelon, was the smaller town of Shunem, a town that had been conquered by Egyptian pharaohs at times. It had been ruled by Philistines until King Saul ejected them, and it was known as the home of Abishag, the woman who warmed the bed of an aging King David in the last months of his life. Now, Abishag was later pursued for marriage by a brother of King Solomon, which was a last act of rebellion against that wise king's ascending to the throne. It had also been home away from home for Elisha, one of the great prophets of old. There was a wealthy older couple who had welcomed him in as he traveled through. They had no children of their own, and they were glad to offer hospitality to the great man and his servant whenever they came by. The wife even had her husband construct a small room up on top of their house just for the prophet to call his own. And Elisha was so grateful that one day he offered to reward their family with status, riches, or a position of importance in the country. And she said, "Oh, no, we have our place among our people. It's our place, and that is enough." So Elisha asked his servant what could be done for these people who had done so much for them, and the servant pointed out that the husband was quite old and the couple had no children. This woman risked becoming a widow. So Elisha told her that when a year had passed, she would have a son of her own. And she protested, but sure enough, she became pregnant, and a son was born, and brought joy to her heart as he grew. And after a number of years, that boy was old enough to go to the fields with his father. One morning, the old man went to direct the harvesters in the fields. But almost immediately, once he was out there, the boy began to be troubled in his actions. He was frowning. He was turning away rather than behaving in his usual manner. And then he cried out to his father, yelling, "Oh, my head! Oh, my head!" And then he collapsed. He was unconscious, and servants carried his body home, and his mother held him in her lap until noon, when his labored breathing stopped, and he was dead. Carefully, quietly, as if she feared to wake him from death, she carried his body upstairs to the prophet's room and laid him on the prophet's bed. And then she closed the door and she went downstairs without a word to anyone in the house. She had her husband get a slave, saddle a donkey. She didn't tell him anything except that she needed a donkey and that she was going to go visit the holy man. And that slave was going to lead her to the home of Elisha, which was in Mount Carmel. That is a 20-mile ride, and the servant leading the animal would be on foot, meaning they could not have traveled that distance in less than about 7 hours of hard travel. And as they approached, Elisha recognized her, and he sent his assistant, whose name was Gehazi, to go and meet her and ask if she, her husband, and her son were all right. Do you know what she told him? Everything is all right. But she kept coming until she had reached the door of the prophet's home, and then she met Elisha in front of the opening, at which point she collapsed, grabbed a hold of his feet, and held on while sobs racked her. "Did I ask you for a son?" she cried. "Didn't I tell you not to raise my hopes?" And her tears flowed freely onto the man's feet. Elisha immediately spoke to his assistant and told him to tuck his robes up into his belt and to run. He said, "Take my staff in your hand and run. Don't greet anyone you meet. And if anyone tries to greet you, ignore them and keep going. Lay my staff on that boy's face." And Gehazi ran as he had never run before, and the prophet got the woman back up onto her donkey and followed behind. The sun had set. Darkness ate the world, but those three went on towards their destination. Reaching the woman's home, going up to the prophet's room, finding the boy's body laid out on the bed, Gehazi took the great man's staff and he placed it on the boy's face as he had been told. And it had the expected result, which was nothing at all, because the dead don't really care what you place on them, and this was no different. So Gehazi went back until he met the prophet and the mother journeying towards town, and he told them that the boy didn't wake up. And when Elisha reached the house, he left the woman below. Well, he climbed the stairs up to his room, and the boy lay there dead on that small bed. Elisha shut the door. He prayed to the Lord. And then he laid his body on the boy's body, breathing his breath into the dead lungs, and the body warmed up, but was still dead, because of course it was. The prophet got up and he began to pace in the tiny room. He went back and forth, his prayers lifting silently to the God he served, his heart broken for this woman whose child, whose hope of a future, whose happiness was dead. And he stopped and he stretched himself out on the body again. And a thing happened. The boy, who was dead, sneezed. And then again. And again. Spray covered the face of the prophet, but he did not care. 7 times the boy sneezed, and then he opened his eyes. Gehazi, yelled the prophet, getting off the boy. And when his assistant opened the door, Elisha sent him to bring the woman upstairs, where he presented her with her son alive and well. She would someday be a widow, but she would always have her boy to care for her. It was a miraculous gift from God, both when he was born and now when he was reborn. Now, for people who live in areas that are steeped in history, the very act of going outside can awaken memories of times gone by and the stories that are told about them. For the people in Nain, walking in a procession behind the men who were carrying the body of a young man who had died, I'm sure that their thoughts must have turned to this old story. It must have just been rippling through their minds, because as that line of mourners came out the gate, they would have turned east towards the stone hillside where tombs had been carved into the mountainside to hold the bodies of their dead until such a time the bones could be collected and put in a stone vase to be laid in a final resting place. And as they did that march, they would have been looking down over Shunem as they did so. On this day, though, through the shared tears and the glare of the late afternoon sunlight in their faces, they would have seen something else, too. There was a crowd coming up the hill. People in that procession with the dead boy, they numbered in the dozens. It was a good turnout for a small town and a woman with no family of her own. There was a lot of folks. But the people heading up towards where they marched were 1,000 or more, possibly a lot more. It was so many that it was only referred to as a multitude. And at the head of that group of people was a cluster of people hanging around a single man. Now, he was nothing special to look at. He was a Jewish man and a holy man from the looks of him, engaging by the deference paid to him by those nearby. And they were close. That crowd was close to where these marchers were carrying this body. Close enough that the man shushed those around him as they came on the funeral. And that man seemed to see it all at once. The bier with a tightly wrapped body leading the way with a single woman behind it, and behind her a line. Her robes, were torn and covered in dust and ashes, which signified her loss and her sadness. It was obvious that he was just so moved by what he saw. He paused only a second before he was waving his followers to stand where they were as he climbed the trail quickly to meet the pallbearers as they went, and he spoke to the boy's mother first, saying, "Don't cry." And he reached out a hand and he touched that coffin they carried, and they all froze in surprise. Other than the family or friends who were needed to prepare and carry the dead, no one touched them. Touching people who were dead was unclean. Even touching the box or the mattress being used to carry a body was enough to defile you. It just wasn't done. And the shock of him having done that was enough to stop the whole parade. But that man had his eyes fixed on the boy's mother. She was so alone. Where family usually crowded together, she had no one. Where parents or in-laws might have stood, there was only empty space. She was a widow, voiceless, lost, and alone. And Jesus, because of course that's who this man was, he held her gaze for a heartbeat, just sharing her grief. And then he turned his attention to the wrapped body in the case being used to transport it to its tomb, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." He hadn't touched the body. There'd been no rituals done or sacrifices made or prayers offered, just a simple, powerful command from a man speaking as if he expected he would be obeyed. And I can't help but think of Elisha sending his staff ahead. Go lay it on the boy's face, as if there was some kind of power in his staff. And there wasn't. And then Elisha laying on that body as if his warmth and his breath were going to restore what was lost when the boy died. And they couldn't. And then the pacing, the trying to understand. He was God's prophet. When he had cursed a gang in the name of the Lord, bears had come to his defense. When he had told a woman who only had a cup of olive oil left to borrow all the jars and buckets and other containers she could from her neighbors, and then to pour oil from her tiny cup out to fill all of those up, she was able to do so. And if God gave him power to do those things, why not this thing? Why not give life to the boy? And when he threw himself back down on the body, realizing that it was always God's power and never his that caused these things to happen, that's when the Lord saw fit to breathe life back into the boy. That's when the Lord repaired what was broken and restored what was lost. Because Elisha was the servant, not the master, and only the master could command life where there was none. Only God. And Jesus held the edge of that bier and looked at the young man who was entwined in sheets and scents and the stillness of death, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And he did. Forcing himself upright against the sheets that were wound around him, the man shook his head until the cloth fell off, and he began calling out. Now I imagine the pallbearers set him down or maybe even dropped him in their rush to step back, and I imagine the words, "What's going on?" were repeated several times, both by the boy and by the spectators, as Jesus helped free him from the wrap and got him up on his feet. And then pulling the boy by his hand, Jesus walked back to where his mother stood and placed that hand in hers, giving the mother back the son that she had lost. And the crowds erupted with excitement. I mean, you'd think they'd be freaked out. I mean, they were, but not in the terrified way you might expect. No, they got it. Here they were, living in a place overlooking somewhere that this very thing had happened once before, and it might have been centuries before, but they knew what had happened and why, and they were filled with awe because of it, and they praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." And the widow was restored. Her voice had been given back to her in the person of her son. Her hope for the future was restored. Her place in the community, which had been ending, was now reborn. This is how God helps his people. He knits them together. Diverse clans and tribes and nations are brought together in community. God's power is shown through the actions of God's people. God's people are God's hands in this world. It is our job to see and feel the pain of others and to act to resolve it. Maybe you or I will never physically bring the dead back to life, but you can help someone to find a place in your community. You can be family for those who have no family. You can provide a place in your community for those who have no place. You can travel with the brokenhearted until they find new joy. You can stop those who are marching towards death and point them back towards life. It may be that we need to try different things in different ways until we find the way. And that's because often we forget that it's God who does the miracles. Maybe we need to do what we can and ask God to take that and use it for something greater. We need to let people know that God has come to help his people. We are just agents of God's kingdom, inviting others to join us. Now, we don't know what happened after Jesus, acting as an agent of God, called that young man back to life. But we do know this. News about this spread until everyone had heard about it. Everyone. What have you done to share the news of the greatness of God? I know sometimes it seems like I put a lot on us, expecting us to go and act as agents of God and act as agents of the kingdom and let people know. And you know what? Maybe it's not calling someone back to life. Maybe it's giving someone back a life that they thought they'd lost. Maybe it's something you could do by inviting someone over to dinner at your house, or by taking them out to grab a burger, just spending time together. What was it this woman was losing in her son? She was losing her community. She was losing her friends. She was losing her ability to live. Those are all things that people in that community could have come together and provided for her. It just wasn't the way that things were usually done. Maybe we need to do things in a different way than they're being done. Grace and peace to each and every one of you this week. Please keep in mind, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever circumstances you find yourself in, God is there. There is nowhere you can go. There's nothing you can do, say, or be that keeps God from being in your presence. God is already there. Just turn and go with God. Catch you all next time.